The book of Exodus summarizes the entire history of this tribe of people that was most particular in that it took records, it took names, it took genealogies, it knew its families, it knew that it was 12, and it knew that it was the tribe of Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher, and all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls, and Joseph was in Egypt already. And arose a king over Egypt who knew not Joseph. That means revolution. That means bondage. That means the darkest days of this small family, this group of people that migrated to Egypt. They became very successful. They wrote their records. Their records were preserved, and their great ancestor was mummified and put into burial in Egypt with the history of the entire family, and then shelved. And arose a king that did not know Joseph. Perhaps it was revolution in the entire Egypt. And the biblical record describes 210 years going by in that time, and the children of Israel grew to massive proportions in Egypt. The next paragraphs go and describe the growing of Egypt, of the Israelite Hebrew tribes in Egypt, how massive they grow and how they were considered to be a threat to the Egyptian regime, and how there were oppressive practices implemented in order to reduce their numbers and to make sure that they didn't breed and multiply as much. And this is a dark period of time, and it's my personal preference not to talk about dark periods of time in periods of great prosperity and great opportunity. Perhaps remember them, but not necessarily to dwell on them. But that was the source of and the inspiration for the entire Exodus operation, to leave this period of servitude and to discover something else. And the entire first chapter of the book of Exodus sums up the worst period for the Israelite people. And by the next chapter, a solution arises from the house of Levi, and where a man marries a woman, takes a woman from the daughters of Levi, and a son is born, and that son, under oppression from the Egyptians, is adopted by the Egyptian court by a series of coincidences, and is raised as an Egyptian, and who takes advantages of all the privileges of the Egyptian nation, and seems to have become aware of the archives of his ancient people. And when Moses was grown up and he discovered the archives of his ancestor Joseph, and the promises and the burial place and the homeland in the land of Canaan, and the identity of these people that were now slaves under a government that he was close to, Moses had an identity crisis. He saw some of his brethren being smitten by an Egyptian, and in their defense he hit them and he killed the Egyptian taskmasters. And he was observed having killed these taskmasters, and he had to escape. And he escaped to the desert. And in the desert he found a high priest of another country, of Midian, of perhaps situated in Saudi Arabia. And he married the family of the high priest of Midian. And he became aware of their practices. And being a master of Egyptian practices, and then experiencing the practices of another culture altogether, he became a master of 2 or perhaps 3, but he was indeed an educated, enlightened individual, and he was to come back to Egypt with a vision. And Moses was content to dwell in the desert with his father-in-law, the high priest of Midian, and who gave Moses Zipporah, his daughter. And Zipporah gave birth to a son who they called Gershom, which meant, I have been a stranger in a strange land. Moses develops an identity which is very distinct. There is no mistake. It is not accidental. He was brought up to be the adopted son of the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh had just died. And Moses, who was in line to the chain of succession of the previous era, was not only in chain of succession, he was with an ideology which integrated the greatness of Egypt on one hand with a nomadic civilization of the Midianites in the desert on the other hand. And God saw the children of Israel, and God took cognizance of them. How coincidental that the Lord God waits for 210 years to cognize the bondage of his people, but only when a person who was prepared, who had all the skills and resources and influences and attributes to take on the Egyptian leadership and to rally from all parts of society and to bring about a revolution. It took 210 years for a man like Moses to emerge in history. For 40 years, Moses took his flock into the wilderness and got to know the wilderness very well. And in one of those times, shortly before his 40th year, he developed a vision in a flame of fire that burnt but was not consumed. And in it, angel appeared and spoke to him. What are these angels? Who is this angel that appears to Moses, that appeared to Abraham, that appeared to Isaac or Jacob? These people, it appears, were couriers, were diplomats, were spies, were people of special ability crossing from Asia to the Middle East, from Mesopotamia to the Euphrates to Egypt, to the Nile, delivering, using code and delivering messages, and were leaders of armies and influencers. And so it seems that Moses now is meeting an angel in a pillar of fire that burns but is not consumed, and is telling Moses a message in regards to freedom. What is he referring to? And I believe that he's referring to a literary device And behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. What burns but is not consumed? Doesn't seem to fit into the worldview of the biblical thinkers. This type of incredible miracle. In fact, it refers to the technology that was being developed here. The technology of literacy, of law, of language, of grammar, of past tense, of present tense, of future tense, on the conjugation of the verb, on the construction of ideas. And Moses undertakes a task of literacy, which was believed to have begun with the high priest of Midian discovering a linguistic system which was developed in the Sinai, or taken and used in the Sinai desert by slaves and workers and craftsmen. It was used and by the Midianites, and it seems to have influenced the Canaanite thinking via Egypt, via Moses. And he was going to conjugate the verb and create linguistic structures which would have complexity in them to cause society to conform to behaviors which in collective choreography would be to their betterment. Moses realized that the greatest tool which was available to ancient Egypt was the tool of law. And he also saw that the new form of conjugation of language using an alphabetical system, which was discovered in the Sinai and is called Proto-Sinaic, because it was uniquely discovered there and several other places, could be the beginning of a transition of ancient knowledge to a new circumstance. So in fact, Moses was not possibly of classic Hebrew thinking per se, but rather an ideological radical which discovered his ancestors, the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, and the book of Joseph, and decided to impact the world. Moses was doing what philosophers have done after him, creating and writing a Platonic Republic style masterpiece, how society should be formed. And his particular contribution was in the form of the tabernacle, the wandering, nomadic tent and collection of instruments that would be used to liberate his people. The penultimate meeting between man and God ever described in a holy book is described here at this moment. And God said unto Moses, I am that I am. And he said, Thou shalt say unto the children of Israel, I am hath sent me unto you. How peculiar, although it becomes a little bit more understandable in the Hebrew language, where the language is Ihyeh Asher Ihyeh, which uses 4 letters of God's name, which are also the key structures to Hebrew grammar. to the past tense, to the future tense, and to the present tense. In fact, what Moses was saying, that the great meeting point of humanity with the divine is in language and in analogy, and the great analogy of the bush that burned but was not consumed will also be an analogy to victory of good over evil. Moses was about to carry out the greatest exodus, a story of biblical proportions, prepared to do so, with the instruments to do so, with an alliance with none other than angels, malachim, this class of experts crossing from nation to nation. He had aligned with, and with the high priests of Midian, and perhaps with some Canaanite groups, and he was determined to demonstrate a message to the new rulers of Egypt on the subject of servitude and slavery and liberty. The next chapters are going to be psychological thrillers, where Moses, who it says in advance that he knew what the reactions of the Pharaoh will be to his request for liberty, was drawing them out, was playing with them, was cajoling, was manipulating, and was eventually, and it says in no unclear terms, that he was going to rob them of their jewels and of their silver, and he was going to escape rich with compensation and punishment for this servitude. And he was going to employ great wonders in doing so. Wonders which no doubt he was practicing for 40 years in the desert of Sinai.